The promise that shattered lives. In the corridors of kingdom halls across the globe, whispers of certainty echoed through the early 1970s. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, had done more than hint. They had virtually guaranteed that 1975 would mark the end of the world as humanity knew it. This wasn't mere speculation or hopeful thinking. It was presented as divine revelation, backed by careful biblical chronology and the authority of God's faithful and discreet slave. Thousands of devoted believers restructured their entire existence around this prophetic deadline. Families sold their homes, convinced they wouldn't need earthly possessions much longer. Students abandoned their education, viewing higher learning as unnecessary preparation for a world that would cease to exist. Career professionals left stable employment, redirecting their energy toward the urgent work of warning others about the impending Armageddon. The faithful were encouraged to live as if each day might be their last in this old system of things. But when the calendar turned to January 1st, 1976, and the world continued spinning on its axis, something far more devastating than the end of the world occurred: the shattering of absolute faith. What followed was not just disappointment, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of damage control that would expose the true nature of organizational accountability. The testimonies that emerged from this period paint a picture so shocking that even decades later, many who lived through it struggle to speak about what really happened after the prophecy failed. The groundwork for the 1975 prediction wasn't laid overnight. Beginning in the 1960s, Watchtower publications began weaving a narrative that would eventually become an unshakable doctrine in the minds of millions. The organization's approach was methodical, building anticipation through a series of carefully crafted articles, books, and convention speeches that presented the date not as possibility, but as divine certainty. The pivotal moment came with the release of Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God in 1966. This publication boldly declared that 1975 would mark 6,000 years of human existence, suggesting that God's rest day, the seventh millennium, would begin with Armageddon. The book didn't merely hint at this possibility. It stated with startling confidence that the timing was more than coincidental. District conventions echoed these themes, with speakers building excitement about the approaching end. Watchtower magazines from this period reveal the systematic nature of the campaign. The May 1, 1968 issue asked readers, "Why are you looking forward to 1975?" The October 8, 1968 issue proclaimed, "The fact that 54 years of the period called the last days have already gone by is highly significant. It means that only a few years, at most, remain before the corrupt system of things dominating the earth is destroyed by God." These weren't isolated statements. They represented a coordinated messaging strategy that left little room for doubt in the minds of faithful readers. Perhaps most damaging were the direct statements from organizational leaders. At a 1967 district convention, a circuit overseer boldly declared, "Just think, brothers, there are only about 90 months left before 6,000 years of man's existence on earth is completed. The majority of people living today will probably be alive when Armageddon breaks out." Such proclamations carried the weight of divine authority, making questioning them tantamount to questioning God himself. The human cost of the 1975 prediction extends far beyond mere disappointment. It represents one of the most devastating examples of organizational manipulation in modern religious history. Former members who lived through this period describe a phenomenon that psychologists would later recognize as collective trauma, where entire communities were simultaneously victimized by the same false promise. Margaret Thompson, a former pioneer who served for over 30 years, recalls the agonizing decision to cash in her retirement savings in 1974. "We were told that retirement planning showed lack of faith," she explains. "I gave everything to the organization, convinced I was investing in eternal life. When 1975 came and went, I was 62 years old with no savings, no pension, and no hope of retirement. The organization that had promised to care for me suddenly became silent about their role in my poverty." The stories of abandoned education are particularly heartbreaking. James Morrison had been accepted to medical school in 1973, but was counseled by local elders to reject the opportunity. "They said I was showing lack of faith by planning for a future that wouldn't exist," he remembers. "I watched my classmates become doctors while I spent my 20s knocking on doors, warning people about an end that never came. By the time I realized what had happened, I was 30 years old with no career prospects and a family to support." Perhaps most tragic were the elderly members who had already sacrificed decades of their lives to the organization. Eleanor Martinez, who had been a witness since the 1930s, had already lived through the failed predictions of 1914, 1918, and 1925. When they said 1975 was different, that this time they were certain, I believed them, she confesses. I sold my house and moved in with my daughter, giving my life savings to the organization. When nothing happened, I realized I had been a fool for 40 years, but I was too old to start over. The psychological impact extended beyond financial ruin. Many former members describe a condition similar to what trauma specialists now recognize as betrayal trauma, the unique psychological damage that occurs when someone we depend on for survival betrays us. Children who grew up during this period report lasting anxiety disorders, depression, and difficulty trusting authority figures. The promise of paradise had been replaced by the reality of manipulation, and the scars ran deeper than many could articulate. Part 3. The Great Cover-Up, How the Organization Rewrote History. When January 1, 1976 dawned without the promised Armageddon, the Watchtower organization faced its greatest crisis of credibility in decades. Rather than accepting responsibility for the failed prediction, leadership launched a sophisticated damage control campaign that would become a masterclass in organizational gaslighting. The strategy was simple yet devastating. Blame the members while erasing the evidence. The first phase involved subtle but significant changes to existing publications. Watchtower literature that had boldly proclaimed 1975 as the year of Armageddon began to disappear from Kingdom Hall libraries. New editions of previously published books contained carefully edited passages that softened or eliminated the most specific predictions. The organization's vast printing apparatus, which had spread the 1975 message to millions, now worked to erase that same message from the historical record. More insidious was the campaign to shift blame onto the faithful members themselves. The March 15, 1980 Watchtower contained a stunning example of this strategy, suggesting that any disappointment about 1975 was the result of members' own wrong expectations rather than organizational teaching. The article implied that overeager witnesses had simply misunderstood the organization's careful statements, conveniently ignoring the bold declarations that had appeared in their own publications. Circuit overseers and district overseers received special instructions on how to handle questions about 1975. Former elders report being coached to redirect conversations away from the failed prediction and toward future hopes. Any member who persisted in asking uncomfortable questions was labeled as having a critical spirit or being spiritually weak. The message was clear. Loyalty to the organization required forgetting the past and focusing on the future. Perhaps most shocking was the treatment of members who had documentary evidence of the organization's specific predictions. Longtime witnesses who had kept collections of old Watchtower magazines and books were encouraged to dispose of outdated literature during periodic spring cleaning campaigns. Kingdom Hall libraries were systematically purged of materials that contained embarrassing predictions. The organization that had once proclaimed the importance of preserving truth was now actively destroying evidence of its own false prophecies. The aftermath of 1975 triggered the largest mass exodus in Jehovah's Witness history up to that point. For many, the failed prediction wasn't just a disappointment. It was a revelation that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the organization they had devoted their lives to serving. The statistics tell only part of the story. Behind every number was a personal crisis of faith that would reshape the religious landscape of the 1980s. Robert Phillips, a former circuit overseer who had served for over 20 years, describes the moment he realized he could no longer represent the organization. I had encouraged hundreds of people to restructure their lives around 1975, he recalls. When I saw families struggling financially because they had followed our counsel, I couldn't sleep at night. I started asking questions, and that's when I discovered how many other predictions had failed. The pattern was undeniable. The exodus wasn't limited to rank-and-file members. Many of the organization's most dedicated servants, elders, pioneers, and even some who had served at the Brooklyn headquarters, began questioning everything they had been taught. Sarah Chen, who had served as a special pioneer for 15 years, describes the crushing realization that she had been deceived. I had given up marriage, children, and a career to serve God full-time, she explains. When 1975 failed, I realized I had been serving an organization, not God. The hardest part was admitting that I had been wrong about something so fundamental. The impact on family structures was devastating. Many marriages that had been held together by shared faith began to crumble as spouses reached different conclusions about the organization's credibility. Children who had grown up expecting the end of the world suddenly had to plan for adulthood in a system they had been taught to reject. The psychological adjustment was overwhelming for many families, leading to increased rates of divorce, depression, and suicide within the witness community. Former Bethelites, full-time volunteers who had worked at the organization's headquarters, provided some of the most damaging testimony about the period following 1975. These individuals had witnessed firsthand how leadership dealt with the crisis, and their accounts paint a picture of an organization more concerned with public relations than with the welfare of its members. Many reported being instructed to downplay or deny the specific nature of the 1975 predictions, even when confronted with the organization's own published statements. Nearly 5 decades after the failed prediction, the trauma of 1975 continues to reverberate through the lives of those who experienced it. Mental health professionals who specialize in religious trauma recognize the 1975 event as a textbook example of how authoritarian religious organizations can inflict lasting psychological damage on their members. The effects extend far beyond the immediate aftermath, creating patterns of distrust and anxiety that persist for generations. Many former members who left the organization after 1975 report ongoing struggles with decision-making and authority. Having been conditioned to rely on organizational guidance for major life choices, they found themselves psychologically unprepared for independent thinking. Recovery often required years of therapy to overcome the learned helplessness that had been systematically cultivated during their years as faithful witnesses. The children who grew up during the 1975 period represent a particularly vulnerable population. Many report lasting anxiety about the future, difficulty forming long-term relationships, and struggles with self-worth. The constant expectation of imminent destruction created a psychological environment where normal childhood development was impossible. These individuals often describe feeling robbed of their youth, forced to carry adult concerns about mortality and judgment from an early age. Perhaps most significantly, the 1975 debacle established a pattern of behavior that continues to define the Watchtower organization today. The same tactics used to handle the 1975 failure, blame shifting, historical revision, and silencing of dissent, have been employed to address subsequent crises. Members who experienced 1975 often report that recognizing these patterns helped them identify later manipulations and eventually led to their departure from the organization. The financial impact of 1975 continues to affect many former members well into their retirement years. Those who were encouraged to forego education, career advancement, or retirement planning in the 1970s often find themselves facing poverty in their golden years. The organization that promised to provide for their needs has shown little interest in addressing the long-term consequences of their failed prediction. The story of 1975 serves as more than just a historical footnote in the annals of religious prophecy. It stands as a powerful warning about the dangers of absolute authority and unquestioning faith. The Watchtower organization's handling of this crisis reveals fundamental truths about how authoritarian structures protect themselves at the expense of their most vulnerable members. What makes the 1975 incident particularly significant is not just the failed prediction itself, but the systematic way in which the organization avoided accountability. By shifting blame to members, erasing historical evidence, and silencing dissent, the Watchtower established a template for crisis management that prioritizes institutional survival over human welfare. This pattern would repeat itself in subsequent decades, from the handling of child abuse scandals to the management of doctrinal changes. For those who lived through 1975, the experience often serves as a catalyst for deeper questions about faith, authority, and personal responsibility. Many report that while the initial trauma was devastating, the eventual recognition of manipulation led to a stronger sense of personal agency and critical thinking skills. The betrayal, while painful, ultimately freed them from a system that demanded unquestioning obedience. The legacy of 1975 extends beyond the Jehovah's Witness community, offering valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand how religious authority can be misused. The tactics employed by the Watchtower, creating urgency, demanding sacrifice, and then avoiding responsibility, are not unique to any single organization. They represent universal patterns of manipulation that can be found in various forms of authoritarian control. Today, as new generations of Jehovah's Witnesses face their own questions about organizational authority and prophetic claims, the story of 1975 remains remarkably relevant. The same organization that once proclaimed absolute certainty about that year's significance now claims that specific date setting is inappropriate, conveniently forgetting their own role in promoting such expectations. For those with the courage to look honestly at this history, the lessons are clear. Human institutions that claim divine authority deserve the highest levels of scrutiny, not blind faith. The individuals who shared their stories about 1975 have performed a valuable service for future generations. Their willingness to speak honestly about their experiences serves as a warning to others who might be tempted to surrender their critical thinking to any organization claiming exclusive access to truth. In the end, the greatest tragedy of 1975 was not the failed prediction itself, but the systematic way in which human dignity was sacrificed to protect institutional reputation. If you or someone you know lived through the 1975 crisis, your story matters. These experiences need to be remembered and shared, not just as historical curiosities, but as vital lessons about the importance of maintaining individual agency in the face of institutional pressure. The courage to speak truth about the past is often the first step toward building a more honest future.